Hello, I'm going to whiz through the research method section of the mock just to give you some tips and to explain the kind of answers and what it was kind of looking for. So question 15 is asking you for an example of an open question. Both B and C were open questions, so you could have had either of those. There was only A that was a closed question. And it says for the advantage, you need to have an open question gives you the opportunity to expand on your answers, go into detail and get qualitative data. You kind of need to put some terminology in there, really. And I might have been, I'm just looking at this one that I'm looking at now, I might have given, it's in-depth answer that gives insight. If you'd have said that, I probably would have given you the mark, but it would have been better to put some terms in there like qualitative data and what have you. But it's a 1 marker, so you might have been all right with what you'd put. They were very brief. That was the only issue with that one. So if you just said, allows in-depth answers, I might not have given it you because it needs like 2 things really to kind of get the mark. It says it on the mark scheme. I'm not just making that up. The second question, third question B, it says, what conclusion might the researchers draw from this table? It tripped a lot of people up, this one. It's because it's really specific on the mark scheme. It wants an overall conclusion of the data. It doesn't want findings like results. It wants a conclusion. What do you conclude from this? So a lot of people were saying most people are helpful, which under normal circumstances would be fine. But the problem with this one is they weren't testing how helpful they were testing how helpful they thought they were. So their perceptions of how helpful they were. So that's what the conclusion is. Most people thought that they were helpful, not most people were helpful. So you would have got 1 out of 2 if you got that confused. Very, very harsh mark scheme. So you've got to be really careful, read the study properly. What are they actually measuring? So you don't need any findings or anything like that. A lot of people are referring to what's in the table. You don't need it. You just need an overall kind of what was kind of concluded from it. So not a finding. What did they conclude? Therefore, what's the overall kind of answer to the study? The next question was about hypotheses. It wanted a suitable experimental hypothesis. So an example being, there will be a significant difference in helping behaviour. So the DV always comes first. Between people who are on their own and people who are, not on their own, so they're with somebody else. That's what it wanted from you. Or you could do a 1-tailed if you really wanted and put something like people who are alone will help significantly more than people who are with somebody else. Yeah, so you could have either of those. If your hypothesis was a bit iffy, if you hadn't predicted a difference, or if you'd, said there is or something like that, you would have lost a mark because it's just a bit vague. Some people were like, I think. That's not how you write a hypothesis. Like there's a standard way of writing hypotheses that you need to follow. It's like a scientific thing. Like it's the same as in maths or science, or hypotheses are the same across all subjects. So there's a structured way that they are presented that you need to follow. Next question about extraneous variables. Try and pick something that's relevant to the scenario. There's a lot of like random things that you're putting down. Like think about what's being measured and how it's being done and things like that. And then think about extraneous variables around that. So for example, in this study, you've got somebody crying in pain. Now that's an extraneous variable because what about if it's not controlled? Like, so for example, for one of the conditions, it's like really loud, and for the other one, it's not very loud, or it's shorter or longer, or it's a woman or it's a man or whatever. If that's not standardized, then you're going to have differences in helping behavior. So that's what it wanted you to explain, an actual variable that's relevant and how it might impact on the helping behavior. And then you need to say how you're going to control it. So think about the Milgram study, just have a recording of a scream, like that would standardize it and it'd be the same for every participant. So that's what that kind of answer was that question was looking for. I'm trying to think if there was any other random ones. Yeah, just go with something obvious like that. Like, I think a couple of people were putting like temperature of the room, or like these just generic ones. You've been told countless times to avoid generic extraneous variables. It's got to be specific to that scenario. What exactly in that study would have an impact if you didn't control for it? So that's what it wants from you. Just thinking, actually, just check in on the mark scheme if there's any other suggestions, just in case that you could have had. Oh, the other one you could have had is the interviewer who falls must be the same, like have consistent interviewer, and the person that's waiting in the room, like the confederate, make sure they're behaving consistently. Those are specific variables that it is looking for that you should really be putting in there, not random ones. Because you'll fall short of that. And there's another question that they asked about extraneous variables, and you couldn't talk about participant variables, and a lot of you did. So you need to avoid problems like that really for those types of questions. Next question was asking for the experimental design. It was an independent groups, so if you didn't put that, you got no marks out of 3. So you need to have that right to then get the rest of the marks. It's suitable because if they were doing both of the conditions, so they were doing the helping when they waited alone or helping when they're with another person, they'd kind of figure out what was going on. You'd get order effects. You get, well, the one that's probably easiest to explain is you'd get demand characteristics because they're doing both conditions of the IV. You'd guess, you'd be like, oh, what are they trying to do here? I might then be more likely to help or less likely to help, or maybe just because of order effects and practice effect, you might have felt guilty for not helping the first time. So then you help in the second time and then you've not got natural results there. So they're going to be invalid. So that's kind of what it wanted from you. You don't want a repeated measures design because you'll get all those problems. You might also say because they're only taking part in one condition of the IV, they're less likely to guess the aim and know what it's about. So that's a little bit more specific. And so then you'll avoid those demand characteristics. But you've got to talk about it in context of that situation. So what I just did there, the example of how it might impact on their helping behaviour, that's what you need to be referring to. Next question, bar chart, because it shows a difference between the conditions. That's all you have to write. Maybe mention what the conditions were. So waiting alone, waiting with another person. There's a lot of stuff written on that, which you were saying, oh, a bar chart because it's easy. What easier than doing a line graph? They're the same. So yeah, you've got to make sure you're mentioning some kind of difference. That's the reason why you use a bar chart. It shows difference. If it was a scatter graph, it shows a relationship. Next question. No, the hypothesis shouldn't be a directional one because there's no evidence of previous research. So how could you do a directional one? You don't know what it will be. You can only predict a directional hypothesis if you have had some previous research and you've got an idea of what you might find. Next question. The answer was 55%. So the calculation was you've got to add up all of the conditions. That'll get you 40. And then you do 22 divided by 40, so that was the better condition, times it by 100, you get 55%. What's meant by primary data? There was a lot of people getting this wrong. You need to look back at what primary data is. It is in your research methods booklet. It's not the first piece of data that's been conducted. I don't know where you've got that from. That's not right. A lot of people writing that. I don't know if you've got that from another subject or whatever. It's not right. Primary research is when, primary data, should I say, is when the researcher has collected the data themselves for the purposes of that study. Secondary data is when it already exists, the data already exists for some other reason, so like the hospital records or whatever, and that they're being analysed by the researcher. So primary data is basically most of psychology because we do experiments and studies and things like that. That's all primary data. So if you've conducted a study for the purposes of that research, you're collecting that data and you're doing it yourself as a researcher, primary data. The mean's the most appropriate, takes into account all the values, therefore is the most representative. So we learnt that in class recently, so that'll get 2 marks. If you don't put the word representative on, you don't get it. The mean values was 63 and 77.4, so you need to add them all together and divide by 10 because that's how many values there are. Discuss the purpose of counterbalancing. Counterbalancing reduces the impact of order effects. It doesn't eliminate them, doesn't get rid of them, which a lot of you were saying. That's not true. I did explain that when I taught it you, so you've got no excuse for getting this mixed up. It reduces the impact, and the reason for that, so you get 1 mark for saying that, you get 1 mark for saying what counterbalancing is, so where you do condition A then B, and then the other group does B then A, so you need to explain the A and the B and the B and the A. That gets you the 2nd mark, and the 3rd mark is for explaining why the order effects are balanced out. So it means that If you do A then B and the other group does B then A, so you split them in half. Then in the second condition, there's order effects for both groups, so 4A and 4B, and therefore they balance out and they don't have an impact in just one condition like they would do if you didn't counterbalance. That's what you need to explain to get full 3 marks. A lot of you didn't do that because I imagine that you didn't really understand it. So you need to look back over that, watch a YouTube video on it or something to kind of get your head around what counterbalancing is, because in order to get that last mark, you need to properly understand it. Next question was, again, the same question, extraneous variable question. You can't talk about participant variables because it's a repeated measures designed with the same person in both groups. So it doesn't matter about participant variables because it's the same person being compared in the first and the second. So you can't have any marks for that. It's not an extraneous variable, it's being controlled. And also they've counterbalanced, so wouldn't be an issue anywhere. Oh no, what am I talking about? That was another point. So people were talking about demand characteristics and stuff, but again, was it demand characteristics or was it something else? No, it was order effects. People were writing order effects, but it's been counterbalanced, so you couldn't have that either. For this one, again, pick something really easy and specific to the situation. The difficulty of the puzzle. That's going to have an impact on how quick they complete that puzzle. They might complete one really, really quick and the other one not really quick. And it's because of the difficulty of the puzzle and not because of what they're interested in, which in this case was whether they're listening to music or not. So you need to explain the difficulty of the puzzle might mean that the music won't be affected how quickly or slowly they complete it. It'll be the difficulty of the puzzle. And again, to control for that, make sure they complete a puzzle of equal difficulty. That's all you have to say. Why the follow-up study is better than the original? You need to put some terminology in, so that was missing a lot of people's. First one was like a self-report questions that were being asked. Probably going to be social desirability bias, so they'll be invalid. But the second one is the follow-up one was an actual study where they've operationalised variables and they've done it in controlled conditions and it's more scientific, established causality, it's probably going to be more valid. You can probably replicate it and get reliable results. Notice how many terms I've mentioned there. You need all of that in there to get 4 marks. You might have picked up 2 marks out of 4 because you'd said a point about the questions and it being an experiment and maybe mention social desirability bias, but you've got to kind of go into a bit more detail about that to get the marks. A case study, again, answered very, very poorly. A case study is not the same in every subject. For psychology, it's very different. So that again, it's in your research methods booklet. A case study is an in-depth study on one individual or a small group of people over a long period of time, and they collect a lot of data, qualitative data, using many methods like questionnaires and experiments and things like that. They'll test them and stuff, and then they'll triangulate all the data. That's the definition of a case study. So a lot of you weren't put in that, so you need to have a look at that again because you can't make it up. It's like it's a specific definition. A lot of people were saying like an important case or someone who's got something wrong with them. Well, yeah, but not really a definition in psychology. So I might have given you 1 mark if you'd, explained a bit. A weakness of it, because it's only a small sample size, one person or a small group of people, you've got issues with population validity. It might not actually be representative of how everyone behaves because you've got a limited sample. That was what you actually needed. Or you could say, because you get lots of qualitative data, there might be some issues with interpreting the data, researcher bias and things like that. Or you could have said the impact of the researcher on the individuals, or you could have mentioned maybe something like ethics, but wishy-washy points. The best one is the population validity one, so that would have got you the 2 marks. Questionnaires and interviews, one advantage and one disadvantage of using a questionnaire rather than an interview. People were just generally saying strengths and weaknesses, not comparing them against each other, so that's why you lost marks. On a questionnaire, you've probably got less chance of social desirability bias because the person isn't there in front of them and it can be anonymous. So you need to compare it with an interview where an interviewer will be right there and you might feel pressure to, give a socially desirable answer. So that would mean that you'd get more valid results in a questionnaire. So again, see how I finished that off. That needs to be on there to get kind of both of the marks. Disadvantage, in fact, no, another strength might be that you can send out lots of questionnaires and get a really large sample size, but with an interview, it takes a long time, so you're probably going to have a small sample size, so therefore your results are going to be less representative, and therefore you're going to have issues with population validity. You can recycle the point from before. What else could you have said? You need training for your interviewer. You don't need training for a questionnaire. So you need a comparison between the two. Disadvantages, you might get a low response rate on questionnaires, so then your sample would be affected. But then if you're comparing that with an interview, you're going to get a small sample size anyway, so you couldn't really use that one. With a questionnaire, a disadvantage is you can't get clarification on the questions, and so you might get a problem with ambiguous questions or leading questions that might then give you an invalid response, or there might be closed questions on there that means that the person is frustrated and can't answer effectively or in a valid way how they would normally, or that might affect reliability because they might answer differently each time. Whereas with an interview, you can ask for clarification and therefore you're more likely to give a more valid response that actually represents what you think. So you could say that, and that would get you the marks. The distribution question, you need to draw it how we did it in class. You need to put the mean, the median, the mode on. You need to draw the kind of curve. You need to put the axes, so frequency, number of participants is on the y-axis. The bottom x-axis was the investment score, 0 to 20. They all need to be on there to get all 3 marks. If you got maybe one error, then you lost a mark. And it was a negative skew distribution. So you can't just put negative, you can't just put skew, you've got to put negative skew to get the mark. And I think that's it.